I have to say it's the people who worked there. Especially in the early days, it was a vibrant place to work. There were a lot of young researchers, bright researchers, and it was a very nice, very pleasant people doing very interesting work, and it was really a vibey place to work. Even though statistics might sound like quite a dull discipline when you're helping researchers, it was very interesting getting involved in all the different research projects that the psychologists there were carrying out. So even though I knew nothing about psychology when I got there, after 27 years I knew probably quite a bit about it. I think when I first started there, a very big project was the Pupil Pilot Project, which was involved with training pilots for the Air Force. I think this was one of the reasons NIPR was started in the first place by Professor Bissievel to work on that particular project. And a lot of work was done over the years in that project, which needed a tremendous amount of computer processing. So it kept the computer division very busy indeed. I also remember in that connection, the NIPR developed a new piece of apparatus called the tilting room, tilting chair, which was a whole room devoted to this thing, which consisted of a chair mounted in a dummy room. And both the room and the chair could be tilted at different angles. And the idea was that people could be divided into basically field-independent people who had a very good sense of whether they were upright, even if the room was at an angle, and field-dependent people who would be very easily influenced by the surroundings. In other words, this tilting room. I remember particularly our librarian, a fierce Hungarian lady called Mrs. Andor, who kept the library under a very tight rein. I was watching when she did this, and when both the room and the chair were tilted at an angle like that, she still thought she was completely upright, even though she'd have actually fallen off the chair if she hadn't been strapped into it. So I suppose that sort of sense is very useful to pilots in flying by the seat of their pants. There was an international biological program one year, and a team from NIPR and from the medical department at the university went out to Sekekuniland to do some field testing, which was very interesting. My role there was as a statistician, was to handle the sampling, which mainly consisted of driving around Sekekuniland in a Land Rover looking for anybody that moved and trying to conscript them into the testing with a promise of meals during the testing session. Also, interestingly enough, they wanted the same people to come back for 2 days because the medical people were doing things like blood tests and the psychologists were doing a number of psychological tests. So they devised a scheme using rubber bracelets with a special machine for stretching these bracelets. So once they'd been put on the wrist, they were quite tight, and the idea was people couldn't take them off. And when they came back the second day, you'd be sure that you had the same person again for the second day. So my role was sampling by driving around in a Land Rover and putting bracelets on the subjects, and in my spare time cooking the meal for the subjects, which consisted of a particularly horrible sort of powdered soup that you mixed up, and it was supposed to be very nutritious and highly fortified. But apparently the fame of this soup spread quite widely, because one day when I was sitting there, everybody else happened to be out of the testing area for some reason. A delegation came, including the Queen of Sekekuniland, who wanted to sample this special soup. So I then became a chef to royalty as well as being a statistician. One that springs to mind was Ipa Poortinga, who was a Dutch psychologist studying in South Africa, or working in South Africa, and he did a lot of work in cross-cultural research. And he's since become one of the leading figures in the movement and has written a book on cross-cultural research. He was very interesting to work for. Another person who was very interesting was Dr. Roining from Personality and Temperament Division, who was a great photographer and took the most interesting photographs in the course of his field work. A lot of research involved working with scientific instruments, and we had an instrument maker there called Dr. Dan de Wet. He was very devoted to NIPR and actually seemed to spend most of his life there It was rumoured that he had a bed somewhere hidden away in the recesses of NRPR, which he'd sleep over at times, and his car was often there. He had an old little original classic Fiat 500, and this was up on bricks in the basement parking garage. He didn't seem to use it that much except for long trips occasionally. Obviously he didn't have to go to work too much if he was living there. And he built all this beautiful apparatus made out of mahogany and brass and steel, incredibly solid stuff. You could have driven a tank over that apparatus and nothing would have happened to it.